12:47 in the morning, June 13th, 1942. 4 men in soaking wet civilian clothes were burying a wooden crate in the sand dunes of Amagansett Beach, Long Island. The fog was so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness offshore, a German U-boat was waiting to submerge before American patrol aircraft spotted it at dawn. George Dasch was shoveling frantically, throwing sand over German military uniforms they'd worn just minutes earlier. Another man buried explosive timers, detonators, blocks of TNT wrapped in waterproof canvas. They'd trained for this moment for months at a facility outside Berlin. The plan was perfect. Get ashore undetected, blend into American cities, begin a 2-year sabotage campaign that would cripple U.S. war production and send the country into panic. Then they heard footsteps. A flashlight beam cut through the fog. A voice called out, "What are you doing out here?" Guard Seaman John Cullen, 21 years old, unarmed, alone on routine beach patrol, was staring at 4 men he didn't recognize doing something in the dunes that made no sense at this hour. Dash's mind went blank. The training hadn't covered this. There was no protocol for encountering a Coast Guard patrol 30 seconds after landing. He made a decision that would collapse the entire operation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of bills. $260. He shoved the money into Cullen's hand and said, "You saw nothing. Forget this. Go back to your station." Cullen looked at the money, looked at Dasch, looked at the other 3 men standing frozen in the fog. He took the cash, nodded slowly, and said he'd seen nothing. Then he backed away into the darkness, his flashlight beam disappearing into the mist. Dasch watched him go and exhaled. Crisis averted. Mission saved. He turned to the others and told them to finish burying the equipment and get to the train station. Within 2 hours, they'd be in New York City, disappearing into the largest metropolis in America, where 8 million people lived and nobody would notice 4 more. What Dasch didn't know was that John Cullen was sprinting back to his Coast Guard station. Within 20 minutes, an alarm would be raised. Within 6 hours, the FBI would be notified. Within 48 hours, Dasch himself would walk into FBI headquarters in Washington and confess everything. And within 8 weeks, 6 of the 8 German saboteurs would be dead in the electric chair. This is the story of Operation Pastorius, Nazi Germany's catastrophic attempt to wage sabotage warfare on American soil. It's a story about how the most well-funded intelligence operation can collapse because of bad personnel selection, psychological miscalculation, and 1 moment of panic on a foggy beach. Before I tell you why George Dasch betrayed his own mission, let me explain what this channel does. Every single day, I bring you real intelligence operations, not Hollywood stories, but actual tradecraft failures, counterintelligence triumphs, and the exact moments where operations collapse because of human psychology. If you're fascinated by how espionage really works, the decisions made under pressure, and why some operations succeed while others implode, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. What happened with Operation Pastorius will show you exactly why personnel selection is more important than any piece of equipment or any amount of funding. Quick question: where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments. I love seeing where these intelligence stories reach around the world. Are you in New York, where this operation unfolded? Berlin, where it was planned? Somewhere else entirely? Let me know. Now let's go back to January 1942 and see how this disaster actually started. By early 1942, Adolf Hitler was furious. The United States had entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, and American industrial capacity was beginning to shift toward full war production. Factories that made automobiles were retooling to build tanks. Shipyards were launching destroyers and cargo vessels at unprecedented rates. Aluminum plants were running triple shifts to supply aircraft manufacturers. Hitler understood that if American industry reached full capacity, Germany would be buried under an avalanche of weapons, vehicles, and supplies flowing to Britain and the Soviet Union. He demanded action. Not diplomatic action, he wanted a spectacular strike on American soil that would prove German reach, disrupt production, and trigger panic among the American public. The responsibility for planning this operation fell to the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and specifically to Section 2, the sabotage division. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, received Hitler's directive with private skepticism. Canaris was a complex figure, a professional intelligence officer who'd served Germany for decades, but harbored growing doubts about the Nazi regime. He understood that a sabotage campaign inside the United States would be extremely difficult to execute and would likely provoke harsh American retaliation. But Hitler had ordered it, and refusing wasn't an option. The Abwehr drafted Operation Pastorius, named after Francis Daniel Pastorius, the founder of Germantown, Pennsylvania. Hitler personally approved the name, viewing it as symbolic, invoking German heritage in America, suggesting that ethnic Germans in the United States might support the Reich's cause. It was propaganda thinking applied to an intelligence operation, which should have been the first warning sign. The mission parameters were ambitious. Insert 2 4-man sabotage teams onto the American East Coast via U-boat. Targets included critical infrastructure, the Horseshoe Curve Railroad choke point in Pennsylvania, Alcoa aluminum plants in New York and Tennessee, Niagara hydroelectric stations, Ohio river locks and dams, and water reservoirs serving New York City and Chicago. There were also civilian terror targets, Jewish-owned department stores in major cities, intended to create panic and demonstrate that nowhere in America was safe. The projected impact was significant. Destroying Horseshoe Curve could delay rail shipments to East Coast ports and factories for weeks. Sabotaging Alcoa plants would reduce aluminum production for aircraft manufacturing, potentially creating fighter and bomber shortages. Hitting hydroelectric stations would cause blackouts across northern industrial regions. The Ohio river locks were critical for transporting steel, coal, and iron needed for tanks and ships. These weren't fantasy targets. In 1942, American infrastructure security was minimal. Horseshoe Curve had no fencing, minimal night patrols. A few kilograms of high explosives could have collapsed the embankment. Alcoa plants were guarded by civilian security with no military training. Hydroelectric stations were underdefended. The vulnerabilities were real. The Abwehr allocated $175,000 in cash to fund the operation, an astronomical sum in 1942, equivalent to over $3 million today. The saboteurs would receive explosives, timing devices, detonators, and detailed target information. They would be inserted by U-boat, establish themselves in American cities, and conduct sustained sabotage operations over 2 years. The critical piece was personnel selection. The Abwehr needed agents who spoke fluent English, understood American culture, could blend into civilian life without raising suspicion, and possessed absolute loyalty to the Nazi cause. They searched POW camps and German expatriate communities for candidates. By March 1942, they'd selected 8 men. All had lived in the United States for extended periods. All spoke English fluently. All supposedly supported the Reich. But the psychological vetting was superficial, rushed, focused on skills rather than ideology or emotional stability. This would prove fatal. The man chosen to lead the Long Island team was George Dasch, a German who'd lived in America for nearly 20 years, working various jobs, eventually returning to Germany in 1941. Dasch was fluent in English, familiar with American customs, and eager for an important role. He was also narcissistic, talkative, emotionally unstable, and secretly doubted Nazi ideology. These traits should have disqualified him immediately, but the Abwehr prioritized language skills over psychological fitness. Another team member was Ernst Berger, who'd been imprisoned briefly in a concentration camp after making anti-Nazi comments. He despised the regime but agreed to participate in the mission, possibly under duress, possibly seeing it as a way to escape Germany. Sending a man who'd been imprisoned for disloyalty was an intelligence failure so fundamental that modern agencies still use it as a case study in what not to do. The other 6, Herbert Haupt, Richard Quirin, Heinrich Heinck, Edward Curling, Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer, had varying degrees of commitment to the mission, but none had the deep ideological conviction necessary for long-term deep cover operations in hostile territory. Training began at Quince Lake near Brandenburg. The saboteurs learned to use explosives, set timers, identify vulnerable points in infrastructure, avoid detection. But the training focused almost entirely on technical skills. There was minimal instruction on counter-surveillance, operational security, or how to function in a country with aggressive domestic counterintelligence. The Abwehr assumed that speaking English and knowing American customs would be sufficient. It wasn't. The saboteurs were issued German military uniforms to wear during beach landings. This was a calculated legal maneuver. Wearing uniforms technically complied with the Geneva Convention, meaning if captured during landing, they could claim to be combatants rather than spies and avoid summary execution. The plan was to strip off the uniforms immediately after landing, bury them, and proceed in civilian clothes. Each team received detailed target lists, operational codebooks, and the massive cash allocation. But there were no pre-established safe houses, no dead drop protocols, no coded communication channels with handlers in Germany, no real clandestine infrastructure. The plan was essentially land on the beach, take cash, blend in, start blowing things up. For a 2-year covert operation, this was astonishingly shallow. Internal Abwehr memos from this period, discovered after the war, described Pastorius as a political showpiece rather than a winnable operation. Some officers privately called it a political operation ordered from above, with negligible military value. Canaris himself reportedly told a subordinate that the mission would likely fail and create propaganda benefits for the enemy. But Hitler wanted it, so it proceeded. By May 1942, everything was ready. The saboteurs boarded 2 U-boats, U-202 and U-584, departing from occupied France. Destination: the American East Coast. Team North would land at Amagansett Beach on Long Island. Team South would land at Ponte Vedra Beach in Florida. Expected mission duration: 2 years of sustained industrial sabotage that would terrorize the American public and disrupt war production. Actual mission duration: 14 days from landing to complete operational collapse. U-202 surfaced offshore from Amagansett Beach at 20 minutes past midnight on June 13, 1942. The conditions were terrible for the Germans, but perfect for secrecy. Heavy fog, calm seas, darkness. 4 men climbed into a rubber raft: George Dasch, Ernst Berger, Richard Quiring, Heinrich Heinck. They paddled toward shore, the U-boat disappearing into the fog behind them. They hit the beach at 12:35. The first action was stripping off the German uniforms and changing into civilian clothes they'd packed. This was done quickly, clumsily, in near total darkness, with only a shielded flashlight for illumination. Then they began burying the uniforms and the 4 wooden crates containing explosives, timing devices, and detonators. This was the critical moment when operational security should have been absolute. No lights, no noise, complete situational awareness. But the saboteurs were focused on the burial, not on perimeter security. Nobody was watching the beach approaches. At 12:47, Coast Guard Seaman John Cullen was walking his routine patrol route along the beach. He'd been assigned to watch for German U-boats, which were known to operate off the East Coast, attacking Allied shipping. The fog was thick enough that he almost walked right into the saboteurs before seeing them. He called out, asking what they were doing. This was the moment when a well-trained team would have used a pre-planned cover story. "We're fishermen. We're locals. Our boat broke down." Something plausible that wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. Dasch panicked instead. He moved toward Cullen and tried intimidation first, asking if Cullen had a mother and implying that cooperation would be healthier for everyone involved. Cullen, unarmed and outnumbered 4-1, stayed calm and said he didn't want trouble. Then Dasch made the catastrophic decision to attempt bribery. He pulled out a roll of bills and shoved $260 into Cullen's hand, roughly $4,000 in today's money. He told Cullen to forget what he'd seen and go back to his station. Cullen, understanding he was outmatched and possibly in danger, took the money and agreed. He backed away slowly, keeping his flashlight pointed at the ground, and disappeared into the fog. Dasch turned to the others and said the problem was solved. They finished burying the equipment and walked to the Amagansett train station, where they caught the first morning train to New York City. By 6 a.m., they were checking into hotels in Manhattan, convinced they'd successfully infiltrated the United States. John Cullen, meanwhile, had sprinted back to the Coast Guard station. He reported the encounter immediately, describing 4 men burying something on the beach, one of whom had bribed him with an enormous sum of cash. His commanding officer activated the alarm protocols. At dawn, Coast Guard personnel searched the beach and found the buried German uniforms and the wooden crates full of explosives. By 6 in the morning, the FBI's counter-sabotage unit was notified. The uniforms were identified as German military issue. The explosives were German military grade. The conclusion was immediate and obvious. Nazi saboteurs had landed on Long Island. The manhunt began. But the FBI had a problem. They didn't know who the saboteurs were, where they'd gone, or what their targets were. The beach provided physical evidence, but no identities. The investigation could take weeks or months, and during that time, the saboteurs could strike. What the FBI didn't know was that the saboteurs were about to solve this problem for them. Meanwhile, 5 days later, on June 17th, the second team landed at Ponte Vedra Beach in Florida. This landing went perfectly. No encounters with patrols, no compromises. Edward Curling, Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer, and Herbert Haupt made it ashore undetected, buried their equipment, and proceeded inland toward Jacksonville. From there, they dispersed toward their assigned cities, Chicago, Cincinnati. They had no idea the Long Island team had been compromised. Back in New York, George Dasch was staying at the Governor Clinton Hotel, carrying a suitcase full of cash and struggling with a decision. He'd been planning this moment for weeks, possibly months. He didn't want to be a saboteur. He wanted to be important, recognized, celebrated. He'd convinced himself that betraying the mission would make him an American hero, that the FBI would treat him with gratitude and respect. Within 48 hours of landing, he told Ernst Berger what he intended to do. Berger, terrified of being executed as a Nazi spy, agreed to cooperate. Dasch telephoned the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. The call went to an FBI operator who didn't believe him. Dasch claimed to be a German agent with critical intelligence about a Nazi sabotage operation. The operator thought it was a crank call and told him to contact his local FBI field office. Dasch insisted. He demanded to speak with J. Edgar Hoover personally. The operator hung up. Dasch called back. This time he was more insistent, more detailed. He mentioned the beach landing, the explosives, the amount of money involved. Someone at the FBI started taking him seriously. They told him to come to FBI headquarters if he had information to share. On June 20th, at 2 in the afternoon, George Dasch walked into FBI headquarters in Washington carrying a suitcase. Inside was $84,000 in cash, operational codebooks, the complete roster of all 8 saboteurs with their descriptions and assigned cities, detailed target lists, sabotage instructions, everything. He set the suitcase on the desk and began talking. The FBI agents thought he was mentally unstable at first. His story sounded too elaborate, too detailed, too conveniently packaged. Then they opened the suitcase and started counting money. $84,000. They checked the serial numbers against financial intelligence databases. The bills were traced to accounts linked to German intelligence operations. They realized this was real. Nazi saboteurs were on American soil, funded with massive amounts of cash, armed with explosives, Abwehr, targeting critical infrastructure, and one of them had just handed over the entire operation. The FBI moved immediately. J. Edgar Hoover was briefed. A nationwide alert went out to field offices. Surveillance was activated in New York and Chicago, Cincinnati, anywhere the saboteurs might be operating. But Hoover made a critical strategic decision: don't arrest them immediately. Give them 72 hours of operational freedom to see if they contact anyone else. Sleeper cells, Nazi sympathizers, other networks. Use them to map the broader threat. So the FBI watched. Plainclothes agents followed the saboteurs to hotels, restaurants, shops, monitored their spending patterns, recorded their conversations. The saboteurs had no idea they were under constant surveillance. The FBI's counterintelligence approach was surgical. They exploited every weakness the Abwehr had built into the operation, and there were many weaknesses to exploit. First, they weaponized Dasch's psychology. FBI agents recognized his narcissism immediately and used it. They treated him with special attention, made him feel important, isolated him from the others, fed his ego. Standard interrogation technique: give the asset what they want emotionally, and they'll give you everything operationally. Dasch provided names, physical descriptions, operational timelines, personal habits of each saboteur, everything the FBI needed. Second, they tracked the money. $175,000 in 1942 was an absurdly suspicious amount. The saboteurs were staying in expensive hotels, the Mayflower in Washington, the Governor Clinton in New York, buying tailored suits, eating at high-end restaurants, acting like wealthy businessmen with no visible source of income. Treasury agents flagged every large cash transaction. Each purchase was a breadcrumb leading directly to the saboteurs. Third, the saboteurs had no safe houses, no operational cells, no clandestine infrastructure. They stayed in public hotels where FBI agents could easily surveil them. The Bureau cross-referenced hotel guest registries against ship manifests, immigration records, anyone who'd lived in America and returned to Germany before the war. Within 72 hours, they had patterns, locations, identities. Fourth, the FBI placed agents at transit choke points. The saboteurs used major train lines, Pennsylvania Railroad, New York Central, because those were the most convenient routes. FBI plainclothes officers monitored every major station, every ticket purchase, every passenger matching the descriptions Dasch had provided. Classic surveillance technique, later adopted by intelligence services worldwide. Fifth, linguistic analysis. During interrogations that came later, FBI linguists identified consistent errors in the saboteurs' English, formal German sentence structures embedded in their speech, mispronunciation of regional American slang, unfamiliarity with current idioms. You claim you're from Chicago, but you've never heard anyone call it the Windy City? These slip-ups broke alibis and forced confessions. Sixth, the FBI isolated the suspects and weaponized paranoia. They told each saboteur that the others had already confessed, that cooperation was the only way to avoid execution. Classic counterintelligence tactic. Most broke within hours. Quirin already gave us everything. Berger confirmed it. You're the last one holding out. It was devastatingly effective. Seventh, the saboteurs carried physical evidence. Codebooks, microdots, operational directives. FBI forensics experts unlocked the entire Pastorius operational plan within days. Modern intelligence services use encrypted communications, memorized codes, nothing written. The Abwehr sent agents with incriminating documents in their luggage. The arrests began on June 22nd. Ernst Berger was taken into custody in New York City. Then Heinrich Heinck. Then Richard Quirin, who was detained only because a train conductor noticed his suitcase was unusually heavy and reported it to railroad security. If that conductor hadn't been suspicious, Quirin might have escaped. Edward Curling, the Florida team leader, was arrested in New York on June 25th. Herbert Haupt was taken in Chicago the next day. Werner Thiel and Hermann Neubauer were both arrested in Chicago on June 27th. Within 14 days of landing on American soil, all 8 saboteurs were in federal custody. 0 successful sabotage operations, 0 targets hit, 0 infrastructure damaged, complete and total operational collapse. J. Edgar Hoover immediately launched a public relations campaign, press conferences, newspaper headlines. FBI captures Nazi saboteurs in brilliant operation. He portrayed the Bureau as having engineered the arrests through superior detective work, masterful surveillance, and relentless investigation. The American public ate it up. The FBI's reputation soared. What Hoover didn't mention publicly was that internal FBI documents told a different story. The arrests were almost entirely due to George Dasch walking into headquarters and confessing voluntarily. The Bureau had done excellent follow-up work, tracking the other saboteurs and executing the arrests cleanly. But the initial break came from Dasch's ego and psychological instability, not from brilliant FBI detective work. Still, Hoover never let facts interfere with a good narrative. The story he told was the story the public believed, and it cemented the FBI's role as America's primary domestic counterintelligence force. By June 27th, all 8 saboteurs were in custody in Washington, D.C. President Franklin Roosevelt was briefed on the arrests. His response was immediate and unambiguous. He wanted them tried by military tribunal, and he wanted executions. Roosevelt authorized a military commission, bypassing civilian courts entirely. This was the first such tribunal since Abraham Lincoln's presidency during the Civil War. Military judges, military prosecutors, military law, no civilian jury, no normal constitutional protections. The proceedings would be classified, the evidence secret, the sentences final. The saboteurs' defense attorneys, appointed military lawyers, argued this violated the Constitution. They filed an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court, arguing that American soil meant civilian jurisdiction, that the saboteurs deserved the same legal protections as any criminal defendant. The Supreme Court heard the case in emergency session. The resulting decision, ex parte quirin, ruled 8-0 that enemy combatants caught conducting warfare on U.S. soil had no right to civilian trial. The military tribunal was constitutional. The saboteurs would face military justice. The trial began on June 27th and ran through July 27th, held on the 5th floor of the Department of Justice building in a room secured by armed guards. No press, no public observers. Classified proceedings. The 8 saboteurs sat in a row facing military judges as prosecutors laid out the entire operation. The evidence was overwhelming. $84,000 in cash seized from Dasch. The explosives buried on beaches and recovered by authorities. German military uniforms. Target lists naming Horseshoe Curve, Alcoa plants, Niagara hydroelectric stations. Operational codebooks. Confessions extracted during interrogations. The defense attorneys did what they could with an impossible case. They argued that wearing German uniforms during landing showed intent to comply with the Geneva Convention. They pointed out that no actual sabotage had been committed. All the saboteurs were arrested before striking any targets. They emphasized that Dasch and Berger had cooperated fully and deserved leniency. The prosecution's response was straightforward. Wearing uniforms was a cynical attempt to exploit legal loopholes while planning to conduct sabotage in civilian clothes. Intent to commit sabotage was sufficient for conviction under the laws of war. Cooperation after capture didn't erase the crime of infiltrating the country with explosives and targeting American infrastructure. The verdict came on August 3, 1942. All 8 convicted. The sentences, 6 would die by electric chair. Dasch and Berger, due to their cooperation, received prison terms. Dasch got 30 years. Berger got life imprisonment. President Roosevelt personally reviewed the sentences. He could have commuted all of them, but he chose to let the 6 death sentences stand. Edward Curling, Werner Theil, Hermann Neubauer, Herbert Haupt, Richard Quirin, Heinrich Heinke would be executed. The executions were scheduled for August 8th at the District of Columbia Jail. Electric chair, noon. One by one, the condemned men were led into the execution chamber. No final statements were recorded, no press witnesses allowed, no public announcement until after the fact. Edward Curling went first, the Florida team leader who'd carried a hit list with names including J. Edgar Hoover and prominent anti-Nazi activists. Then Herbert Haupt, the youngest at 22 years old. Then Werner Thiel, Heinrich Heinke, Richard Quirin, Hermann Neubauer. Each execution took several minutes. By 1 in the afternoon, all 6 were dead. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves in a potter's field. The executions were announced publicly the next day. American newspapers reported it as a great victory. Nazi saboteurs defeated. Justice served. America protected. What wasn't reported was the full story, that the entire operation had collapsed because of one man's narcissism and a bribery attempt on a foggy beach. George Dasch and Ernst Berger were transferred to federal prison to begin serving their sentences. Dasch spent his time writing letters, filing appeals, demanding recognition as the man who'd saved America from Nazi sabotage. Nobody listened. He wasn't a hero. He was a traitor who'd gotten 6 men killed and then complained that he wasn't being thanked properly. I have to stop here and ask you something. George Dasch thought he was doing the right thing, saving American lives, stopping Nazi sabotage, becoming a hero. Instead, he spent decades in prison and was eventually deported to Germany, where he was hated as a traitor. 6 men died because of his confession. But if he'd stayed silent, those 6 might have destroyed critical infrastructure and killed American civilians. Was Dasch a hero or a traitor? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious how you see this morally impossible situation. Here's what happened next. In 1948, President Harry Truman commuted both remaining sentences and deported Dasch and Berger to Germany. Neither man was welcomed. In Germany, they were traitors who'd betrayed their country and gotten fellow Germans executed. Dasch spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name, writing memoirs, giving interviews to anyone who would listen, insisting he'd been an American patriot. Nobody cared. He died in 1992, bitter and forgotten. Ernst Berger disappeared into obscurity in Germany and died sometime in the 1970s. The 6 executed men remained in unmarked graves until some of their families decades later tried to recover the bodies. Most failed. John Cullen, the Coast Guard seaman who'd taken the bribe on the beach and then reported it, received a commendation and a $1,000 reward. He never spoke publicly about the incident. He understood that his decision to play along instead of confronting the saboteurs had likely saved his life. He died in 2011. The legal precedent from ex parte Quirin remained. The Supreme Court decision established that enemy combatants conducting operations on U.S. soil could be tried by military tribunal without civilian court protections. This precedent was cited decades later in Guantanamo Bay detainee cases, war on terror legal arguments, enemy combatant definitions. Operation Pastorius's legal legacy extended far beyond 1942, but the intelligence lessons were what mattered most to future operations. When Israel established Mossad in 1949, the new intelligence service began studying historical operations to develop operational doctrine. Pastorius became a foundational case study, analyzed not for politics, but for mechanics. What worked? What failed? Why? The Mossad assessment was clinical and brutal. Operation Pastorius demonstrated catastrophic personnel selection, non-existent operational infrastructure, poor counterintelligence awareness, and fatal psychological miscalculation. The report identified 7 critical errors that modern intelligence services still teach as cautionary examples. Error 1, personnel selection based on skills rather than psychology. The Abwehr chose agents who spoke English and knew American culture, but ignored psychological fitness. Dasch's narcissism, Berger's ideological doubts. These should have disqualified them immediately. Modern Mossad psychological screening is exhaustive, involving months of evaluation, stress testing, loyalty verification. An agent like Dasch would never make it past the initial interview. Error 2. 0 operational infrastructure, no safe houses, no pre-positioned assets, no communication networks. Compare this to how Soviet illegals programs worked or how Mossad runs deep cover operations today. Years of preparation, established identities, embedded support systems, layered cover stories. The Pastorius saboteurs were thrown into hostile territory with cash and targets, but no actual infrastructure. Error 3. Excessive cash without financial cover. $175,000 with no business, no employment, no explanation for wealth. Modern operations use legitimate business fronts, offshore accounts, layered financial structures that can withstand scrutiny. The Pastorius cash was a flashing neon sign saying, "Investigate us." Error 4. Single point of failure. The entire operation depended on beach landings going undetected. No backup insertion methods. No contingency plans if compromised. No redundancy. Modern operations build in multiple layers. If the primary approach fails, secondary and tertiary methods activate. Error 5. No counterintelligence awareness. The saboteurs had no concept of FBI capabilities, no surveillance detection training, no operational security protocols, no understanding of American counterintelligence posture. They operated as if they were invisible, which made them easy targets. Error 6. Shallow cover legends. Backstories that couldn't withstand basic questioning. Modern deep cover operatives live their legends for years before deployment. They have employment histories, social connections, verifiable backgrounds. The Pastorius saboteurs had stories they'd rehearsed for weeks. Error 7. Psychological miscalculation. The Abwehr assumed ideological commitment and personal discipline would hold under pressure. They got neither. Personnel psychology is more important than technical training, and the Abwehr ignored this fundamental principle. During the Cold War, CIA counterintelligence studied Pastorius extensively to understand how the FBI had succeeded. The case became required reading at CIA training facilities. Key lessons extracted. Exploit defector psychology using ego and fear. Track financial movements to identify patterns, monitor transit choke points, isolate suspects to induce paranoia, move rapidly once compromise is detected. These techniques became standard CIA counterintelligence doctrine and were used successfully against Soviet intelligence operations throughout the Cold War. But Pastorius also had hidden consequences that extended beyond intelligence tradecraft. First, American infrastructure hardening. After the operation collapsed, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers quietly secured every targeted site. Horseshoe Curve got fencing, lighting, and armed guards. Alcoa aluminum plants received military security details. Niagara hydroelectric stations were hardened with enhanced perimeter security. Ohio river locks got surveillance systems. These improvements were classified but prevented any future sabotage attempts during the war. Second, the end of German sabotage operations in America. Pastorius's total failure convinced the Abwehr to abandon U.S. operations entirely. A planned Phase 2, involving 12 more saboteurs targeting East Coast ports and assassination of public figures, was canceled. Operation Magpie, designed to insert agents into Canada, never left the planning stages. Hitler's dream of terrorizing the American home front died with Pastorius. Third, FBI expansion. Hoover used Pastorius to justify massive FBI growth. More agents, bigger budgets, enhanced surveillance powers, expanded counterintelligence operations. The success, even though it was mostly handed to the FBI by Dasch, became the foundation for FBI dominance in domestic security for decades. Fourth, potential acceleration of strategic bombing. Declassified U.S. military documents revealed contingency plans. If the sabotage campaign had succeeded, if American infrastructure had been damaged, if civilian casualties had occurred, the United States had plans for immediate mass air raids on German industrial cities. This would have happened months earlier than the historical strategic bombing campaign. Pastorius's failure may have actually delayed bombing escalation and saved German civilian lives in 1942. There were also facts about the operation that remained hidden for decades, only emerging through declassified documents and post-war investigations. Fact 1. Dasch claimed in his memoir that he'd contemplated murdering his entire team on the U-boat to prevent the sabotage campaign. He supposedly considered it his duty to save America from Hitler. He decided against it, believing confession would be more heroic and would get him better treatment. Fact 2. The saboteurs had planned to purchase a farm. The Long Island team intended to buy rural property for $15,000 to $20,000 to use as an explosives storage site and clandestine training camp. This massive financial transaction would have exposed them immediately, but they didn't understand how financial surveillance worked. Fact 3. Each saboteur carried a panic envelope with $3,500 cash, a new identity, and escape route instructions to Mexico City. None of them used these envelopes. Most didn't even open them before arrest, suggesting they never truly believed they'd need to run. Fact 4. Edward Curling, the Florida team leader, carried a hit list. Targets included J. Edgar Hoover, business leaders aiding British supply chains, and prominent anti-Nazi activists. This assassination component was never publicly disclosed, likely to avoid creating additional panic. Fact 5. A destroyed Abwehr memo referenced fears of an FBI mole inside German intelligence. This was never proven, but the paranoia may have affected operational planning and contributed to the sloppiness in Pastorius's execution. Fact 6. One saboteur was nearly missed entirely. Richard Quirin was detained only because a railroad conductor thought his suitcase was unusually heavy and reported it to security. Without that random observation from a vigilant employee, Quirin might have slipped through the FBI dragnet. Fact 7. The saboteurs were supposed to be Phase 1. Phase 2, never launched, included insertion of 12 to 16 more saboteurs, bombing of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and a sustained campaign lasting into 1944. The complete failure of Phase 1 killed all subsequent plans. If you've made it this far, thank you for going deep into one of World War II's most fascinating intelligence failures. This channel brings you real espionage stories every single day, actual operations, detailed tradecraft analysis, the psychology behind why some missions succeed and others implode spectacularly. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. But before we finish, there's one final revelation about Operation Pastorius you need to hear. Final question for you. If the Abwehr had sent 8 committed, disciplined, ideologically loyal agents instead of the team they actually chose, could Pastorius have succeeded? Could 8 well-trained saboteurs have crippled American war production in 1942 and changed the course of the war? Or was the mission fundamentally doomed from the start because FBI counterintelligence was too strong? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. In 1954, researchers discovered a classified Abwehr planning document in captured German archives. It was dated April 1942, outlining the operational concept for Pastorius. In the margin was a handwritten note attributed to Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. This mission serves political purposes. Military value, negligible. Expected outcome, failure with propaganda, benefit to the enemy. Canaris knew. He understood from the beginning that the operation was doomed. He sent the saboteurs anyway because Hitler had ordered it, because political pressure overrode operational judgment, because sometimes intelligence services execute missions they know will fail just to satisfy political masters. This is the human element that gets lost in tactical analysis. George Dasch spent 50 years trying to convince anyone who would listen that he was a hero, that he'd saved American lives, that he deserved recognition. He wrote memoirs, gave interviews, contacted American officials repeatedly. Nobody cared. In Germany, he was hated as the traitor who'd gotten 6 men executed. In America, he was remembered as a failed Nazi spy whose confession was more about ego than patriotism. The 6 executed saboteurs were buried in unmarked graves. After the war, some families tried to recover the bodies for proper burial in Germany. Most attempts failed. The men remain in Potter's Field graves somewhere in the Washington, D.C. area, their exact locations lost to bureaucratic record-keeping failures. The Coast Guard station at Amagansett, where John Cullen reported the landing, still stands. though it's been repurposed. The beach looks the same today as it did in 1942. Tourists walk where saboteurs buried explosives. 80 years ago, there's a small historical marker noting the landing, but most people walk past without reading it. Operation Pastorius failed because the Abwehr prioritized language skills over loyalty, because they sent men who could speak English but couldn't stay silent, because one moment of panic on a foggy beach triggered a cascade that collapsed the entire operation. The bribery attempt, $260 pressed into John Cullen's hand at 12:47 in the morning, set everything in motion. The alarm, the FBI investigation, Dasch's confession, the arrests, the executions, all of it traced back to that single decision. Today, Pastorius is taught at FBI Academy, CIA training facilities, and Mossad headquarters. Not as a triumph of law enforcement, though the FBI executed the arrests professionally. Not as a failure of German intelligence, though the Abwehr's mistakes were comprehensive. It's taught as a lesson in what happens when you ignore the human element. When you assume skills equal loyalty, when you think funding and equipment can overcome psychological weakness. In espionage, technology is replaceable, training is repeatable, but psychology is everything. The Abwehr sent agents who spoke perfect English but had imperfect commitment. That gap between capability and loyalty killed the operation before the first saboteur stepped onto American soil. Operation Pastorius failed because the Abwehr sent men who could speak English but couldn't keep silent. In espionage, language is the easy part. Loyalty is what matters. And loyalty, in the end, is what they didn't have.